He thought he could embarrass her in front of everyone. But the moment Rachel Monroe walked through those glass doors, the outcome was already sealed in silence. The gym buzzed with energy that afternoon, the sharp clang of iron plates echoing across polished concrete floors, neon lights reflecting off chrome machines, and the faint scent of rubber and sweat hanging in the air like a badge of discipline. Derek Shaw stood at the center of it all, broad-shouldered, confident, his voice cutting through the noise as he coached a circle of eager trainees, each one watching him like he was the standard they had to reach. And maybe he believed that too, until Rachel stepped inside, unnoticed at first, dressed in a simple gray hoodie, worn sneakers, her presence quiet enough to be ignored but steady enough to feel. She moved past the front desk with a polite nod, her eyes scanning the room not with awe, but with a calm familiarity that didn't match the way she looked, and that was the first thing no one understood. Derek noticed her when she paused near the edge of the mat, arms folded loosely, observing, not admiring, not intimidated, just watching. His lips curled slightly as he leaned toward one of his students, muttering something that sparked a ripple of quiet laughter, because in a place like this, people were judged fast, and she didn't fit the image, not the expensive gear, not the aggressive posture, not the loud confidence, just a simple woman standing where others fought for attention. You lost? Derek called out, loud enough for nearby groups to hear, his tone casual but edged with mockery. Rachel turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze without a flicker of offense, just looking around. She replied softly, her voice even, almost too calm for the environment. A few students exchanged amused glances, someone whispered something under their breath, the kind of comment meant to shrink a person down to size. But Rachel didn't react, didn't defend, didn't retreat, and that stillness made something shift, subtle, almost invisible. Derek stepped closer, sizing her up the way people do when they've already made up their mind. This isn't a beginner's class, he said, gesturing around the mat where bodies moved with practiced precision. We train seriously here. The words landed heavier than they sounded, layered with assumption, with dismissal, with the quiet belief that she didn't belong. Rachel nodded once, as if acknowledging something deeper than his words. I understand, she said, and for a moment, it should have ended there. But Derek wasn't finished, because sometimes ego needs an audience, and the room was already watching, the circle tightening, the noise lowering just enough to catch every word. Tell you what, he continued, stepping back with a smirk that drew attention like gravity. Why don't you try a round? Just for fun. A few chuckles broke out, phones subtly raised, anticipation building not for a fight, but for a spectacle, the kind that makes people feel better about themselves. Rachel glanced at the mat, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes steadied, like a door quietly closing behind it. You sure? She asked, not challenging, not hesitant, just asking. Derek laughed, short and confident. Yeah. Don't worry, I'll go easy. And that was the moment everything locked into place, though no one realized it yet. Rachel reached up, slowly pulling off her hoodie, folding it neatly over the bench beside her, her movements unhurried, controlled, deliberate, and as the fabric slipped from her shoulders, a faint scar traced along her forearm, barely noticeable, but real enough to tell a story no one here had heard. The room leaned in without knowing why, the laughter fading into a quieter tension, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted, something Derek couldn't name but felt anyway. Because the way she stepped onto that mat didn't look like someone trying to prove anything. It looked like someone who already knew exactly what was about to happen. And for the first time that day, the noise of the gym seemed to fall just a little too quiet the moment Rachel stepped onto the mat. The air changed in a way no one could quite explain. The usual background noise of clanking weights and casual chatter fading into a low murmur as people instinctively shifted closer. Forming a loose circle around the center, Derek rolled his shoulders with an easy confidence, flashing a grin toward the small crowd that had gathered, clearly enjoying the attention. Keep it light, he said casually, though the tone carried something else beneath it, something performative, like he was already narrating the outcome in his head. A few of the trainees chuckled, one of them whispering, "This will be over in seconds." But Rachel did not respond. She simply stepped into position, her feet settling naturally against the mat as if they had been there 1,000 times before, her posture relaxed but balanced, her breathing steady, and that calm began to draw attention in a different way. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. Derek circled once, slow and deliberate, as if giving her time to feel out of place, as if waiting for hesitation to show, but it never came. Rachel's gaze followed him, not tense, not reactive, just aware, the kind of awareness that does not come from guessing but from knowing. "You ready?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, his voice loud enough for the crowd to catch every word. Rachel gave a small nod. Nothing more, no bravado, no nervous laugh, just a quiet agreement. And then there was a brief pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, where everyone seems to hold their breath without realizing it. Someone in the back shifted their weight, another lowered their phone slightly, uncertain why they suddenly felt less certain about what they were about to watch. Derek moved first, quick but controlled, expecting the usual reaction, expecting uncertainty, but Rachel did not step back the way he anticipated. She adjusted, minimal, precise, almost effortless, her movement so small it barely registered, and for a split second, Derek hesitated, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something did not line up with what he expected. The rhythm he relied on was not there, the predictable response he counted on simply did not exist, and in that tiny break in rhythm, Rachel shifted again, her foot placement exact, her balance centered, her timing perfectly aligned, and suddenly Derek found himself stopping mid-motion, recalibrating in a way that no one in that room had ever seen from him before. A faint crease appeared between his brows, the first sign that something was off. The crowd noticed it too, subtle but real, the laughter from earlier now completely gone, replaced by a quiet tension that wrapped around the space like a tightening coil. Rachel did not press forward aggressively. She did not rush or force anything. Instead, she maintained that same calm presence, letting the moment unfold, letting Derek come to her pace instead of the other way around. And that shift, that reversal of control, was something no one had expected. Derek tried again, sharper this time, more focused, but Rachel's response came even cleaner, a simple redirection, controlled and efficient, leaving him just slightly out of position, not enough to cause harm, but enough to be undeniable. A murmur spread through the crowd, low and uncertain. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" Another voice answered, "No, what just happened?" Derek stepped back half a pace, his confidence not gone but no longer effortless, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully now, not as a joke, not as a distraction, but as a variable he had underestimated. Rachel remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing unchanged, her eyes steady, and in that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with control, quiet, undeniable control, and the realization began to spread, slow but certain, that this was no longer entertainment. This was something else entirely, something none of them had prepared for. And as Derek took a deeper breath, resetting his stance with a seriousness that had not been there before, one thought moved silently through the room, almost like a shared instinct. They were not watching a beginner. They were watching someone who had been here long before any of them. And the most unsettling part was that Rachel Monroe had not even begun to reveal what she was truly capable of. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, thick and uneasy, as Derek adjusted his stance once more, but this time there was no smirk, no casual confidence, only focus, sharp and deliberate. His eyes locked onto Rachel as if trying to solve something that should have been simple, but was not. The crowd could feel it now, the shift, the moment when a situation stopped being entertainment and started becoming real. Rachel did not move. She did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there, grounded, composed, her presence steady in a way that made the space around her feel smaller, tighter, as if everything now revolved around that quiet center she held. Derek exhaled slowly, stepping in again, more careful this time, testing rather than assuming, and Rachel responded with the same economy of motion, no wasted energy, no unnecessary reaction, each adjustment precise, controlled, almost effortless. And it was in that control that the truth began to reveal itself, not through force, not through spectacle, but through timing, through awareness, through a level of calm that could not be faked. A few people in the crowd leaned closer, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. One of the trainees whispered, "She is not reacting like a beginner." Another answered under their breath, "She is not reacting at all." And that was exactly it. Rachel was not reacting. She was guiding, subtly, invisibly, shaping the pace of the exchange without ever appearing to take control, and Derek felt it. Even if he could not yet fully understand it, his movements grew sharper, faster, trying to reassert the rhythm he was used to, but every attempt seemed to dissolve the moment it reached her, redirected, softened, neutralized before it could become anything more. And then it happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A single moment where Derek stepped in expecting to close the distance the way he always did, only to find himself paused, off balance in the smallest way, just enough to break the illusion of control. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the entire room felt it. The realization cracking through the surface, the understanding that something was fundamentally different about this woman standing in front of him. Rachel did not capitalize with aggression. She did not push forward to dominate. Instead, she simply held the moment, letting it settle, letting Derek feel it fully, and that restraint, that decision not to overwhelm but to reveal, made the shift even more powerful. The crowd went completely quiet now. No whispers, no laughter, only the faint hum of overhead lights and the sound of steady breathing. Someone near the back lowered their phone entirely. No longer sure what they were witnessing, Derek took a step back, not out of fear, but out of recalibration, his mind racing to adjust, to understand, to regain the ground he thought he had never lost. But the truth was already there, written in the stillness. Rachel Monroe was not here to prove herself. She was here because she already knew. And as she met his gaze once more, calm and unwavering, there was no challenge in her eyes, no need for validation. Only a quiet certainty that made one thing painfully clear to everyone watching. The outcome had been decided long before Derek ever opened his mouth, and now, all that remained was for the room to catch up to a reality it had not seen coming. The air did not move. It pressed in, heavy and expectant, as Derek stood there for a second longer than he intended, his breath slower now, his confidence no longer automatic but forced into place. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that mat, he was not performing for the crowd. He was thinking, calculating, trying to understand the woman in front of him who had dismantled his rhythm without raising her voice or breaking her calm. Rachel remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, not challenging him, not provoking, simply present in a way that made everything else feel unnecessary. Derek shifted his weight again, this time more cautiously, circling with a tighter focus, testing angles, watching for something, anything that would give him back control. But Rachel met every movement with quiet precision, not chasing, not retreating, just aligning. And that alignment made it impossible for him to find an opening the way he usually did. A faint murmur tried to rise from the edge of the crowd, but died quickly, swallowed by the tension that now held the room still. One of the trainees who had laughed earlier now stood with arms folded tightly, eyes narrowed, studying Rachel in a way that suggested recognition, not of her face, but of her skill, because what she was doing could not be faked, it could not be improvised. It came from something deeper, something practiced, something lived. Derek stepped in once more, sharper, more committed. But again Rachel adjusted with that same quiet efficiency, her timing exact, her positioning flawless. And this time the shift was undeniable. Derek stopped completely, his body still, his expression no longer confident but searching. And in that stillness, something inside him clicked, not defeat, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives when the illusion finally breaks. Rachel lowered her hand slightly, not as a sign of weakness but of control, as if to say she did not need to prove anything further. And that subtle gesture spoke louder than anything she could have said. The room felt it, a ripple of understanding passing through the crowd as eyes widened, as posture changed, as people began to see what had been there from the beginning. Derek exhaled, longer this time, stepping back half a step, his gaze fixed on Rachel with a seriousness that had replaced every trace of mockery. And then, almost reluctantly, he gave a small nod, not to concede, but to acknowledge, in that moment, quiet and unspoken, carried more weight than any loud victory ever could. A voice from the back broke the silence. Hesitant but clear, "She has trained before." Another voice followed, lower, more certain. "Not just trained, she has competed." The words spread quickly, not loud, but enough to shift the entire perception of the room, enough to make every earlier laugh feel misplaced. Rachel did not react to the whispers. She did not turn, did not correct them. She simply stepped back from the center of the mat as if the moment had already passed for her, as if this had never been about proving something to anyone else. Derek watched her, the realization settling deeper now, not just that he had underestimated her, but that he had misunderstood the entire situation from the beginning. And as Rachel reached for her folded hoodie, lifting it calmly, her movements once again simple and unremarkable, the contrast struck everyone at once. How someone so unassuming could carry something so undeniable. And in that contrast lay the lesson that no one in that room would forget, because it was not just about skill, it was about judgment, about assumptions, about the quiet danger of believing you understand someone based on what you see in the first 5 seconds. Rachel slipped her hoodie back on, her expression unchanged, her presence returning to that same quiet anonymity she had entered with. But the room was not the same anymore. Derek opened his mouth slightly as if to say something, but no words came, because whatever he might have said would have sounded smaller than the truth he had just experienced. And so he said nothing, and in that silence, heavier than any noise that had filled the gym before, the reality settled fully into place. Respect had not been demanded, it had been revealed, and it had arrived without warning, without noise, and without any need for permission. No one spoke at first. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they did not know how to say it without admitting they had been wrong. The gym that once echoed with laughter now held a silence so complete it felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were holding onto the moment. Rachel Monroe stood near the edge of the mat, adjusting the sleeve of her hoodie with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if this had been just another quiet afternoon. But the eyes on her told a different story. Derek remained where he was, his stance no longer defensive, no longer performative, just still, his gaze fixed on her with a level of focus that had replaced every trace of earlier arrogance. He was not looking at her the same way anymore, not as someone out of place, but as someone he had failed to recognize, and that realization settled heavier than any loss ever could. One of the trainees finally shifted, stepping closer with cautious curiosity. "Where did you train?" he asked. His voice softer now, stripped of the confidence it carried before. Rachel paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something in her expression, not pride, not reluctance, just memory. "Different places," she replied simply, her tone even, offering nothing more than what was asked. The answer only deepened the curiosity. Another voice spoke from behind. "You moved like you have done this for years." Rachel gave a small nod, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the observation without feeding it, because for her, this was not something to explain, it was something lived. Derek finally stepped forward, slow, deliberate, each step measured as if he was recalibrating not just his position, but his understanding. The room instinctively made space for him, not out of authority, but out of anticipation. He stopped a few feet away from Rachel, close enough to speak without raising his voice. And when he did, the tone was different, quieter, grounded. "I misjudged you," he said, the words simple, direct, carrying no excuse, no deflection, just truth. Rachel met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "It happens," she replied, not dismissive, not forgiving, just stating something that felt bigger than the moment itself. And that was when it landed, fully, for everyone watching. This had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about revealing something right, something that had always been there beneath the surface. Derek nodded slowly, the weight of his earlier words now clear in his mind, the casual mockery, the assumptions, the ease with which he had placed her in a box she did not belong in. And now that box no longer existed. The illusion had been stripped away completely. A faint sound broke the silence, a pair of hands coming together in a hesitant clap, then another, and another, until the room filled with a quiet but genuine recognition, not loud, not celebratory, but respectful, the kind of acknowledgement that comes when people realize they have witnessed something real. Rachel did not react to the applause. She simply picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder with the same understated ease, as if the attention was something she neither needed nor wanted. And as she turned toward the exit, the crowd parted without being asked, creating a path not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Derek watched her go, his expression thoughtful now, no longer the center of the room, no longer the unquestioned authority, but something else, something quieter, something more aware. And as Rachel reached the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, she paused for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to leave a presence behind. And then she stepped out into the fading light, leaving the gym exactly as she had entered, unnoticed by most at first, but impossible to forget once seen. And in the stillness that followed, one truth settled over everyone who had been there. Respect was never about who spoke the loudest or stood the tallest. It was about who remained steady when everything else tried to shake them. And that day, the room had learned what that kind of quiet strength really looked like. The door had barely closed behind Rachel Monroe when the noise of the outside world seemed to return all at once. But inside the gym, nothing moved the way it used to. The energy that once thrived on confidence and loud authority now lingered in a quieter, more reflective space. Derek remained standing in the center of the mat, his hands resting loosely at his sides, not commanding attention anymore, but absorbing what had just unfolded. The trainees who once circled him now stood at a distance, not out of disrespect, but because something had shifted in their understanding of what strength actually looked like. One of them finally spoke, breaking the silence with hesitation. "Coach, who was she?" The question hung in the air longer than expected, because for the first time, Derek did not have an immediate answer. He looked toward the door where Rachel had exited, his jaw tightening slightly as he replayed every moment, every assumption, every word he had chosen so casually, and how easily they had been undone. "Someone we should not have underestimated," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, but carrying more weight than any instruction he had ever given. The room absorbed that, not just the words, but the tone behind them, the acceptance, the shift. Another trainee stepped forward, the same one who had laughed earlier, his expression now thoughtful, almost uneasy. "She did not even try to show off," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Derek nodded slowly. "She did not need to," he replied. And that was the part that stayed with them, not the movements, not the outcome, but the control, the restraint, the quiet confidence that never demanded attention yet commanded it completely. A few people began to talk among themselves, voices low, piecing together what they had witnessed, some recalling small details they had missed at first, the way she stood, the way she watched, the way she never reacted the way they expected, and with each realization, the earlier laughter felt more distant, more misplaced. Derek walked toward the edge of the mat, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried a lesson he had not planned to learn that day. He reached the bench where Rachel had folded her hoodie earlier, his hand hovering for a moment as if the space still held her presence. Then he lowered it, exhaling quietly. "We train hard here," he said, turning back to the group. But today was not about training harder. The trainees looked at him, waiting, not for instruction, but for understanding. "It was about seeing clearly," he continued, his eyes moving across the room, meeting each of theirs in turn, and most of us did not. No one argued, no one needed to, because they all felt it, the truth settling in a way that could not be ignored. One of the newer members raised a hand slightly, unsure. "So what do we do now?" Derek paused, considering the question, not as a coach giving direction, but as someone who had just had his own perspective challenged. "We start paying attention," he said finally, "not just to how people look, but to how they move, how they carry themselves, how they respond when no one is watching." The words landed differently than his usual commands. They were not about drills or technique. They were about awareness, about humility, about something deeper than skill. The group nodded, not out of routine, but because they understood that something had changed, not just in the room, but in themselves. The rest of the session continued, but it felt different, quieter, more focused. Each movement now carried a level of intention that had not been there before, and even as the sounds of training slowly returned, they never fully drowned out the memory of what had happened, because moments like that do not fade easily. They settle, they stay, they reshape the way people see. And somewhere outside, Rachel Monroe walked down the sidewalk, blending back into the ordinary flow of the city, her steps steady, her expression calm, as if the entire moment had already passed for her, as if it had never been about the room, or the crowd, or the recognition, but about something far simpler, something she carried long before she ever stepped into that gym. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, one quiet truth remained. The strongest presence in any room is not the one that demands to be seen, but the one that cannot be ignored once it is understood. The lesson did not end when Rachel Monroe walked out of that gym. It lingered, quietly embedding itself into every corner of the space, into every thought that followed. And over the next few days, something subtle but undeniable began to change. Derek noticed it first, not in the way people trained, but in the way they looked at each other. There was less noise, less showing off, more observation, more patience, as if everyone had become aware of how much they had missed before. One afternoon, as the late sunlight filtered through the tall front windows, casting long golden lines across the floor, a new member stepped hesitantly inside, dressed simply, carrying the same uncertainty that Rachel once had. And for a brief moment, the old pattern almost returned. A few glances, a quiet evaluation, the instinct to categorize. But it stopped there, interrupted by something stronger, something remembered. Derek saw it unfold and said nothing. He did not need to, because the room had already learned. The new member approached cautiously, asking where to begin, and instead of dismissive laughter, one of the trainees stepped forward with a respectful nod, offering guidance without assumption. And that small moment carried more weight than any demonstration ever could, because it showed that something real had shifted, not just in Derek, but in everyone who had witnessed that day. Later, as the session progressed, Derek found himself pausing more often, watching, not just correcting technique, but observing presence, the way someone held themselves, the way they responded under pressure, the quiet details that revealed far more than surface appearance. And every now and then, without warning, his mind would return to that exact moment when Rachel had stood across from him, calm and unshaken, and how easily she had changed everything without trying to. One of the senior trainees approached him during a break, wiping sweat from his brow, his tone thoughtful. "You ever think she will come back?" Derek looked toward the entrance, the glass doors reflecting the movement of the street outside, and for a second, he considered it, not as a coach waiting for a challenge, but as someone who had been given a rare opportunity to see something clearly. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I do not think she needs to." The trainee nodded, understanding more than the words themselves, because Rachel's presence had never depended on staying. It had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed something that could not be unseen. That evening, as the gym began to empty and the lights dimmed slightly, Derek stayed behind a little longer than usual, standing alone in the center of the mat where everything had shifted, the echoes of that day still present in the silence. He took a slow breath, letting it out as he looked around the space he thought he fully understood before, and now saw differently, not as a place to prove dominance, but as a place to refine awareness, to build something deeper than strength alone. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, cars passing, people walking, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place inside those walls. And somewhere in that flow, Rachel Monroe continued her life, unseen, unrecognized by most, her routine as simple as ever, because for her, nothing had changed. She had not come to teach a lesson. She had not come to make a statement. She had simply been herself, and that had been enough. Back inside the gym, Derek reached down, adjusting the edge of the mat with a small, almost absent motion, then straightened, his posture no longer rigid with ego, but grounded in something steadier, something earned. And as he turned off the final row of lights, leaving only a soft glow across the empty space, one thought settled quietly in his mind, the kind that does not demand attention, but stays with you long after the moment has passed. The greatest strength is not in how loudly you can prove yourself, but in how quietly you understand others. And that was something no amount of training alone could ever teach. Weeks passed. But the echo of that moment never truly faded. It settled into the rhythm of the gym like a quiet pulse beneath every movement, every breath, every decision, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the place transformed, not in appearance, not in equipment, but in awareness. People no longer rushed to prove themselves. They watched more, listened more, learned in ways that did not require attention. Derek saw it in the smallest details, the way someone paused before speaking, the way a trainee chose to help instead of judge, the way silence was no longer uncomfortable but respected. And one evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the front windows in warm amber light, the door opened again, softly, without announcement. A familiar stillness entered before anyone even turned to look. Rachel Monroe stepped inside, dressed just as simply as before, her presence unchanged, quiet, grounded, almost invisible at first glance. But this time, the room felt it immediately. Conversations slowed, movements softened, and one by one, heads turned, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with recognition. Derek noticed her from across the mat, his posture shifting subtly, not into defense, but into awareness, and without hesitation, he walked toward her, not with authority, but with respect. "You came back," he said, his voice calm, steady. Rachel gave a small nod, her eyes taking in the room as if measuring something beyond the surface. "Just for a bit," she replied, simple as always. But this time, no one laughed, no one whispered. The energy was different, grounded in something real. One of the trainees who had once mocked her stepped forward slightly, then stopped, unsure, not out of fear, but out of respect, as if understanding that presence like hers was not something to interrupt casually. Derek gestured toward the mat, not as an invitation to prove anything, but as an acknowledgement. "If you feel like it," he said, leaving the choice entirely hers. Rachel looked at the space for a moment, then shook her head gently. "Not today," she answered, and that was enough. No disappointment, no pressure, because the need to see more had already been replaced by the understanding of what had already been shown. Instead, she stepped to the side, observing quietly as the session continued. And something remarkable happened. The room did not try to impress her. It did not shift into performance mode. It simply continued, but better, more focused, more intentional, as if her presence had reminded everyone of the standard they now carried within themselves. Derek ran the session differently too, his voice calmer, his instructions sharper but quieter, emphasizing control, awareness, balance, not dominance, not speed, and every now and then, he would glance toward Rachel, not for approval, but as a reminder of the lesson he had learned the hard way. After some time, the session slowed, people catching their breath, the atmosphere calm and steady. Rachel stepped forward slightly, just enough to be heard without raising her voice. "You are doing better," she said, her tone neutral, but the words carried weight. Derek gave a small nod. "We are trying," he replied, and there was no pride in it, just honesty. Rachel looked around once more, her gaze moving from person to person, not judging, not evaluating, just seeing, truly seeing. And that was something none of them would forget, because it felt different from being watched. It felt like being understood. And as she turned to leave again, the room did not follow her with questions. It did not ask for explanations or stories, because by now, they understood that some people do not need to explain who they are. They show it in ways that cannot be argued. Derek watched her reach the door, that same quiet presence moving through the space without resistance. And just before she stepped out, he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for her to hear. "Thank you." Rachel paused for a fraction of a second, her hand resting on the door. Then she nodded once, without turning back, and stepped into the evening light, leaving the gym behind, but not the impact, because as the door closed, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of growth, full of a truth that no one there would ever unlearn. And in that quiet, steady space, something had finally settled into place. Not just skill, not just discipline, but respect, earned not through force, but through presence. And that was something far more powerful than anything they had trained before. The gym did not return to what it once was. Because once something true is seen, it cannot be unseen. And in the weeks that followed Rachel Monroe's quiet departures, her presence became something more than a memory. It became a standard, not spoken, not written on any wall, but carried in the way people moved, the way they thought, the way they chose their words before speaking. Derek felt it every single day, in the pauses between instructions, in the silence that no longer felt empty but intentional, and in the way respect now entered the room before any sound did. One evening, as the final class of the day came to an end, the lights dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the mat. Derek stood alone again, much like he had after the first time she left. But this time, there was no confusion, no searching, only clarity. He walked slowly across the floor, each step measured, each breath steady, until he reached the center, the exact place where everything had shifted, and he stopped, not because he needed to, but because he understood what that space represented now. It was no longer just a place for training. It was a place where assumptions had been broken, where ego had been challenged, where truth had quietly replaced illusion. A faint sound came from the entrance, the soft click of the door opening, and for a moment, something in him wondered if she had returned again, but it was only a passerby, someone new, someone unknown, and Derek watched as they stepped inside, unsure, hesitant, carrying the same uncertainty Rachel once had, and this time, there was no hesitation in how the room responded. One of the trainees approached with a calm nod, offering guidance without judgment. Another adjusted their stance, making space without being asked, and Derek realized in that moment that the lesson had fully taken root, not because Rachel was there to reinforce it, but because they had chosen to carry it forward. He turned his gaze back to the mat, the quiet weight of understanding settling deeper, and a thought moved through him, not loud, not dramatic, but certain. The strongest moments are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that change how you see everything after. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights reflecting softly against the pavement, and somewhere in that quiet movement of life, Rachel Monroe continued forward, her path unchanged, her presence as steady as ever, because for her, nothing had needed to change. She had never been there to prove anything, never needed the recognition, never sought the acknowledgement. She simply existed in a way that revealed truth when others were ready to see it. And that was something no title, no reputation, no loud voice could ever replace. Back inside the gym, the last of the lights flickered off,